Welcome to the Motor Carriers Insurance Education Foundation's monthly truck stop webinars. These truck stops are presented the second Thursday of each month at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. These webinars are open to members of the Motor Carriers Insurance Education Foundation only. These seminars are presented as industry updates for information purposes only. You do not qualify for state CE credit for these webinars. However, we do provide as a foundation state CE credits. If you're seeking state CE credits, please visit our website at MCIEF.org or email Beth at trs@mcief.org. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat window. They'll be answered as time allows or responded to after the webinar is over, which is most often how we do this. And if the questions are generic enough or broad enough, we'll share all the questions and answers to everybody. Obviously, we won't pick on any individual people or companies, but we'll do that. If you experience any problems during this webinar, please send us a note again in the chat window or call 800-741-4084. We'll attempt to correct the problems as soon as possible. We've been hearing a lot of discussions about CSA and the revamping of CSA and the reports that are supposed to be due here. And I thought this was an interesting subject for this month. So I called Shuie from Central Analysis Bureau and Gene to see if they would put something together as these changes are going to affect possibly the insurance element. We're hearing a lot of the public publicity now for people are putting out as it might affect the motor carrier, but I think we need to spend a few minutes to look at it as it might affect the insurance providers and you as a retail agent and insurance company. So that ends, Shuie, will you please introduce yourself? And I think you got Gene there, and we'll start this up, my friend.
Hello, everybody. My name is Shuie Yankelewitz. I'm the CEO here at CAB, together with Gene Gardner, my partner, who's the CEO of CAB.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon.
So,
go ahead. No.
So Gene and I are going to be doing this together. And you know, as Tommy introduced it, CSA is a hot topic, but the truth is CSA has been a hot topic since CSA became a topic. And it seems like it's been riding a wave since the beginning of 2010 when it really was approaching the December 2010 launch. CSA was very much a point of contention where there were different organizations, both in the motor carrier industry and on the insurance side, that were advocating against it. And the FMCSA has historically since then been trying to defend their use of CSA as a means of targeted enforcement. It's very important to understand the perspectives of CSA. Obviously, when you have a score and something that scores individual companies, and there are going to be individual companies that have adverse scores, there are always going to be people that are going to not be happy with such a system in place, especially when it's beyond enforcement and these scores are actually used by third parties, whether it's insurance companies or shippers or any individual who's using it to assess the actual motor carrier themselves. You can imagine why these scores are contentious. And since 2010 to date, there's been a lot of churn on CSA. The methodology has evolved over time, over this past year since 2010. And as we are right now, this new churn in the market is not CSA, it's CSA and IRT, all these different terms. We need to understand it because there's a lot of chatter and a lot of information and a lot of misinformation, and what we decided was that this was a good opportunity to discuss CSA as it specifically is relevant to insurance companies and to insurers. If you're looking at CSA scores, why do you care about CSA scores? What do the CSA scores even mean? And then the obvious questions of where are we and where are we going with it? And really the top level agenda here is why does this matter to insurance companies? This is a score that was designed by the enforcement industry. This is a score that was designed by the enforcement industry specifically to target their enforcement of motor carriers. So why, as insurance companies, do we care about these scores?
And you know, as we start to talk about this, we all have to remember that from the insurance company's perspective, even before CSA came into place, insurance companies were historically trying to quantify and look at certain aspects of any kind of trucking company operation to see how it impacted the analysis of their book, the evaluation of their book of business. So in early years, as you know, from what CAB's been doing for 80 years, we did financial analysis because that was where the information was. And insurance companies would look at the financial stability of trucking companies because that was reflective of the ability of that trucking company to operate safely. So they looked at those features. Prior to CSA coming into place, one of the things that the insurance industry had done with CAB was create a severe violations category. And this was before any scoring methodology ever came into place with the government, because the insurance industries recognized that there were certain violations that motor carriers would get, which from their predictive analytics or their overall analysis of their loss runs would impact the exposure. It's now evolved into a much greater evaluation, and we'll talk about that together, because we know what it does when it comes to losses. Because at the end of the day, the trucking company cares about continuing their business operation, getting their freight delivered, making their customer happy. The insurance company is concerned about the risk and the loss that occurs and whether or not this information is going to impact the potential exposure to them. So there's two components to this, and we'll talk about this as we go forward.
So we have CSA, which is a Compliance Safety Accountability. It used to stand for something else historically, for those of you that like little random pieces of information, and SMS, which is a Safety Measurement System, and now we have this new hot term called IRT. And all these different terms, they're all different, they're all reflective of using data by the FMCSA to target their enforcement. We are insurance companies. Why do we care about this? And the answer is, for obvious reasons, that while the FMCSA's mission is enforcement, and the FMCSA's use of this information is to create a more efficient and more targeted intervention process for the benefit of reducing crashes. Remember that this has never been about predicting crashes. It's about reducing crashes on the road, and there's a very big difference between those. But insurance companies are all about risk assessment. When you're underwriting, you're the gatekeepers. You're the ones that are actually looking at this account, and you have to determine whether or not this information can help you, to select a good risk. And for that reason, your perspective has an overlying commonality with the FMCSA, which is that everybody's interested in the reduction of crashes. Reduction in crashes helps the FMCSA in the enforcement mission, and reduction of crashes helps an insurance company have a better bottom line.
But it doesn't minimize for the insurance company, and that's something that has to be, everybody needs to recognize that there's that different agenda there. So the insurance companies have losses that do not arise out of a crash, are not reflective of a crash. If you're writing, for example, everybody knows I'm a big cargo person. Cargo claims do not necessarily arise as a result of an accident, but they do arise potentially as a result of a poor safety culture of a particular trucking company. Certain types of auto liability losses or general liability losses will also not arise from a crash, but they are predictive of whether or not there's a safety problem there.
Gene,
So,
there's
yes.
a point that I bring up on this part of it too, and I'd never thought in this time thing, but one of the things I'm talking now with the new Food Modernization Act is that the driver's got to be able to check the temperature of the loads before they put them on there. And that gets all back, has the driver been properly trained for their total job? And that's what you're saying too here. So if they're sloppy one way, they have a tendency to be sloppy in another way. And so it all kind of comes together. And, and even when they sign for drop and hook, they got a note on the invoice how to protect themselves and note the seal number and all that stuff. So I think that's a good, I appreciate you putting that in, because I think it's a good carryover for everything here. If you either do it right or you're sloppy. I've told many loss prevention people, and I think you all agree with me, safety is not one thing, it's the overall culture you create.
Correct. And I think that's part of the issue that we're going to try to talk about.
Yeah, so I mean, as to recap some of what Gene just mentioned, underwriting, hate to reduce it to a guesswork, but really it's investigative and educated guesswork based on available information. The more available your information is and the more you can process the information, the more your educated guess is going to be. The bottom line is, in the terminology, is we call them risks. That's what they are. Insurance companies look at each policy as a risk, and they're referred to as risks. Why are they called risks? Because it is a risk. Ultimately, the insurance company is determining that they're going to take a risk and hope that they win in the gamble that they're taking. And the hope is really more than just hope and crossing your fingers and flipping a coin. It really comes down to understanding how data and information can be used to correlate to enhance performance over the overall safety of and really risk assessment of this motor carrier. So again, underwriting, this is what our focus is. Our focus is insurance, and it's really more than just underwriting, because predictive analytics is really a step back before the underwriting, which helps insurance companies using loss runs, using their own data, together with any additional data they can get their hands on, figure out which information is more correlation and predictive for their uses to help them define what their rates should be, what rates will actually allow them to turn a profit, what rates will allow them to make better underwriting decisions. Risk assessment is more than just crashes, as Gene just said. They're really, crashes are obviously one of the primary reasons for a claim, but they're not the exclusive reason for a claim. And for that reason, whether it's spoilage or whether it's cargo or whether it's something related to,
even just a basic fender bender in a parking lot.
Yeah.
That doesn't result in a DOT crash report because it just happened inside the business location of the insured, is a claim that can result in loss.
Right, and safety culture, which is really the underlying theme of everything related to CSA. Everything related to CSA is all about the safety culture. It's about trying to determine how, as Gene introduced, with the financials, it's also about safety culture. If somebody doesn't have money, then they're going to start compromising on things. If somebody doesn't have enough money to keep their brakes up to par, they're gonna get, let them wear down a little bit more. They'll get used tires. So things that happen, whether it's finances, whether it's just little occurrences, seatbelts, and we'll talk about each of these different types of things that can happen, but every little piece of information creates a bigger picture and is part of a bigger picture. And since it's part of a bigger picture, if we can harness those pieces of information effectively, then we can help try to use it to see what is the likelihood of this risk being less risky.
And everybody talks about the underwriting component of it, and I know that's always the focus of who we're going to write and why are we going to write them. But there's this separate component of it, claims management and the reduction in loss expenses. The combined loss ratio is what keeps insurance, as long as a good combined loss ratio is something that keeps an insurance company in business. It's critical to the trucking industry that they continue to have a selection of insurance companies. It keeps the market more stable. It allows for reductions in premiums. It allows for insurance companies to select the type of book of business that they want to go after. But in order to do that, they have to make sure that they keep their losses in the appropriate place. And having all of this information allows them to really manage those claims better. And we'll talk about this a little bit more as we go on. But years ago, you had a truck accident, and you looked at the truck accident, and most of the underlying litigation was about the actual events of the particular event, the particular accident, and maybe a day or two before. But now, almost every truck accident winds up with a discovery where they're looking at all of the information that comes along with that truck or comes along with that driver. It changes the nature of the claim. Something that was a basic truck accident before is now blown up into something much greater because of the fact that this data is out there. If the insurance company is not looking at that data from the beginning, they can't be aware, they can't properly judge whether or not that claim is going to be a $100,000 claim or a $500,000 claim. The mitigating or aggravating factors that come up in the data substantially impact the indemnity payments and expenses.
So we can see that this is, insurers care way beyond just underwriting. As the use of this information allows insurance companies, which again, the nature of their entire existence is risk. It allows them to make better decisions by taking this information and understanding how it correlates to their moving bottom line. And what it allows them to do is to determine whether or not they can use available information to try and preempt any problems or try to mitigate the problems or try to even, as Gene said, in the event of a problem, reduce the cost of a claim, the expenses of a claim, and that in and of itself is allowing them to have a better operation altogether. So again, just to summarize, the motivation for enhanced risk assessment, there's really a parallel here, and we can start seeing, we say, why do we care? As an insurance companies, why do we care about this information? If our focus is enhanced risk assessment and the FMCSA is about enforcement, then why do we care? And the answer is obviously enhanced risk assessment allows both parties, whether it's the FMCSA for enforcement or insurance companies, to really, whether it's identifying the exposures and claims cost reduction, which is a savings of dollars, which helps the bottom loss ratios. FMCSA is all about the crash reduction, and to try and reduce crashes statistically using information, you're going to use the data for targeted interventions. And that's really what the FMCSA's mission has always been about. CSA has always been about targeted interventions, using the information to help reduce crashes. And for that reason, insurance companies and FMCSA alike have an invested interest in understanding and how this information can be used to correlate to eventual either claims or crashes. Now, what's important to note is that data has always been used. This is not a new thing. It's just what's really changed over time is the available information and maybe the technologies and the methodologies that allow them to do it. But using data to determine a safety culture has always been an underlying theme, both for the FMCSA and for insurers. Sometimes there isn't enough information available, and therefore things have to be somewhat randomized. But to the degree that information has been available, the FMCSA, before CSA, there was the SafeStat program, and before that, it was before my times. But
smart aleck.
But
not mine either.
See, Tom, we got to get on this guy. He thinks he's too young.
I agree with you.
But if you think about it, even before you went to CSA, and before that information came out there, what information was there? Okay, so you look at the financials, you look at whether they were going up, they were going down. Insurance companies would look at the filing history, because there was a concern that if you showed a consistent change in insurance filings, that if you went from company A to B to C, D, every year you were flipping insurance companies. That was a piece of data that an underwriter would want to take a look at, because it was reflective of something happening. They weren't staying with the same insurance company. They didn't necessarily know why. Maybe it was because of losses. Maybe it was because the insurance company wasn't doing a good job. Maybe it was the motor carrier's fault. But there was the ability then to look at that as at least a piece of data that would give you some reflection on how to carve out who is the right insured.
And
the Shuie mentioned the SafeStat. I know that we've had some information earlier where ISS scores became important, and a couple of carriers use the ISS scores as a measure of something through that. So we've been trying to do this a lot of times, trying to figure out what does all this mean. And I think totally agree with you. What we have now is more data on what is happening on the roadway that we didn't have before, because what you just showed out, Gene, is things we looked after the fact. And I think it's one of the whole purpose of CSA, was it not, is to try to look at what we could predict and look at who needs to pay attention to before the crash happens, which is all of our objectives.
Right, and it's not predicting the crash, but it's about trying to use the information to reduce the crash. And the difference between those two is that predicting a crash says that I can know that if somebody does A, then he's going to be involved in a crash. And we'll talk about that in a moment in terms of the actual severity weights as they correlate to the actual violations. But the FMCSA has never indicated that it can use this information to predict a crash. To predict a crash means taking every single possible variable and barring some supercomputer with artificial intelligence, with the ability to really assess every possible scenario. Even then, I would venture to say it's pretty difficult to predict a crash. However, the underlying theme of everything related to a moving truck on the road, or even a stationary truck on the road, comes down to safety culture, because nobody's going to deny the fact that if a company, even a company with a perfect safety culture, someone who's really, really aggressive in managing, making sure that they have no problems, make sure that everything's in tip-top shape, even they can be involved in a crash. So this information, no one's saying that this information perfectly predicts crashes. That was never the objective. It's simply that using statistics, using mathematics, using probability, and using these statistical methodologies, what actually you can do is use the information to use the probability and the information to intervene at the appropriate point and thereby reduce the overall crash. So it's not about the individual, it's on a macro level. It's looking at the entire industry. There are going to be a certain number of crashes. But if we can improve the safety culture of certain motor carriers, then statistically speaking, we should be able to improve what would have otherwise been the crash rate. And that's, I think, the most important thing to keep in mind is that everyone's always been wanting to use information. Everyone's been trying to figure out how can we create a better process to make it more efficient and more effective. The FMCSA can't possibly have a person at site of every single motor carrier in the country. They can't do it. It's literally not possible. So therefore, they have to try to create efficiencies. And creating efficiencies means trying to use information to identify points that if you correct them, they can reduce the likelihood of a crash. Again, not eliminate the crash, but reduce the likelihood of crash. And insurance companies are the same way. If they can use this information to be able to work with or price around those motor carriers that are more likely to have fewer crashes, that can help them in the risk assessment to say that this is something that's more palatable or this is something that should cost X, Y, Z amount, because from a predictive modeling standpoint, that type of premium rate makes the most sense for the assigned risk.
And it's interesting because all of that makes perfect sense. And the problem that has arisen, as we all know, is the fact that this information had that purpose, which is the evaluation of risk and the hopeful reduction in crashes. But what's happened is that information has wound its way into the plaintiff's bar, into the litigations, and has now resulted in just so many increased risks and just really a lack of understanding of what it means. Many people have heard me tell the story about being on a bus in commuting into Manhattan one day after a big bus accident on the Garden State Parkway in New Jersey, and I got on the bus and I sat next to the person I sit next to all the time, and she said, "Oh, did you hear about the bus crash last night?" And I said, "Yeah, because we all got stuck in traffic." And she said, "Oh my goodness, they had all these violations." And she didn't have the faintest clue what she was talking about, because she was somebody that worked on Wall Street, and she didn't know what that was, but she heard it on the radio. And of course because I had no other life, I had actually looked at all the violations that particular bus company had, and the violations that existed had absolutely nothing to do with the cause of that loss. But it didn't matter. That was ultimately the jury pool in the county where the loss occurred, and so it has taken on a life of its own, separate and apart from its reasons and needs for the CSA and for the insurance company.
And you see, to that extent, and that's a very important point, to that extent, there's a bit of a misalignment between the FMCSA's mission and the insurance company's mission, because in that case, they were trying to figure out cause. Insurance companies, at the end of the day, their cause and their mission is about the business of insurance, which means identifying the risks that will ultimately result in a claim that they will have to pay out on. If they don't have to, if there's a reason why it's not at fault or it's covered by a different company, it's less of a concern. But the data would never necessarily have told it in this particular case, because the actual sequence of events had absolutely nothing to do with the actual violations that took place. And therefore, again, this comes down to, and we're going to keep rehashing it, it comes down to probability. It's the likelihood. It's crash reduction. It's not predicting the crash. It's just using these statistics and using this data to make a better decision, to say that this information, these types of violations, have been identified as correlated to a poor safety culture. And we'll talk about what that means. It's correlated to a poor safety culture, but it's very important to understand that this is what they're looking at. They're trying to make a good decision and say this information will help us improve our risk assessment, and therefore they're going to be using it. And different insurance companies, in my personal experience working with insurance companies for a good number of years now, different insurance companies have had different areas of concern, different areas, different appetites altogether. Some insurance companies specifically are underwriting where they know that these motor carriers are less, less desirable, the subprime. They found a way to business, to build a business around that. They found a way to price around that. It really comes down to pricing when you're dealing with insurance companies. They're here to be able to write the business. Insurance companies are not about declining this. I always tell people that I would make the world's worst underwriter, because when you're sitting in the data, You know, you're sitting there all day. You just get like scared. I mean, you don't want to drive anywhere near a truck ever
It's
again.
analysis paralysis.
It's analysis. It's not just analysis paralysis. Everything starts looking scary. It's like, oh my goodness, look at these violations. Like, could you imagine that statistically speaking, 1 out of every 5 trucks that's inspected is taken out of service? So if you're driving on the road and you count 4 trucks, then that 5th truck, statistically speaking, shouldn't be on the road. It's frightening. But, you know, insurance companies are about writing business, not declining business. And everybody who's listening here is about looking for ways to use this information to write business, to prioritize business, because you don't want to only look for the good accounts that everyone else is looking for. You want to find ways to qualify an account and say, you know, they may have bad data, but the bad data doesn't really correlate to their culture. They recognize that they hired a bad driver one time. They got rid of him right away. Well, guess what? They've got a stain now on their record in CSA. But they can use the information to say, look, since I got rid of this driver, since I got rid of this vehicle, you can see that I care and my safety culture is focused. You can use this information to qualify a good risk despite the existence of adverse data. So moving along, CSA yesterday is, you know, we're talking about yesterday, today, and tomorrow. We've kind of covered what CSA yesterday was. CSA, when it started, was all about targeted intervention and how to make more efficient use of DOT resources. That's what the FMCSA's mission statement was, and it continues to be their mission statement, but that's where it all started. And they wanted to be able to identify chronic problems based on the various risk factors, which meant identifying what is a risk factor also. They wanted to use CSA to create a structured intervention process, which did ultimately play out, and that includes sending out warning letters, sending out the on-site interventions, but making the on-site interventions, rather than being full-scale compliance reviews, allowing them to be very targeted to the different areas where this motor carrier may be lacking somewhat safety-wise. The methodology specific, we're not going to get into too much detail about the current CSA methodology, but the one most important thing that I think is worth talking about here is a violation severity weight. And these violation severity weights are thrown around almost irresponsibly in the industry because people say, oh, it's 1 to 10, scale 1 to 10, 10 being, oh my God, the guy like he's got, I mean, whatever it is.
He was watching a Tyler Perry movie.
Right, he's watching, yeah, we saw one crazy violation. Guy was watching a Tyler Perry movie on the screen that was blocking his windshield while he was high. So yes, do not drive near that guy. But the violation severity weights are separate to each of the current basics. So basics are the six inspection-based categories, the 7th one being the crash. But the 6 inspection-based categories that there are, within each of those, there are certain violations that are categorized in that specific category. And within that particular category, every violation is scaled on is weighted on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the worst. So that means that if you're looking at, let's say, drugs and alcohol, someone driving while high on amphetamines, and he's going to get a 10, doesn't necessarily correlate to somebody, maybe I don't even know what the other 10s are, but let's say speeding 15 miles or more above the speed limit, which is in unsafe driving, and also has a severity weight of 10. Common sense says, well, those two are not related. And the FMCSA has always put a big star there saying, do not compare the 10 in one category to the 10 in another category. This is within each basic alone. What they've tried to do is to say within this particular category, here's the kinds of violations that contribute to this category, and here's the severity weight when compared against other violations in this category to have, the key point here is that it's not saying that this will result in a crash, but rather, using the FMCSA's expert analysis and determination, they allow them to determine what the predictability of that violation impacting their safety culture is. So it's not about saying that this violation will make them be involved in a crash, but rather the existence of this violation implies a poor safety culture. And it is incredibly important to keep this in mind because people talk about the severity weights and they try to ask the following question. And this is a question that we've heard many times from different people. If you look at unsafe driving, the seatbelts are weighted at a severity weight of 7, whereas dangerous driving is a severity weight of 5. Now I ask you, if you ask the average person, if he didn't put his seatbelt on or he was driving dangerously, which one's more likely to be involved in a crash? And the answer if we're talking about the causality of the data, that a violation resulting in a crash, I would venture to say that if you got up in the morning one day and decided, you know what, heck, today I'm not wearing my seatbelt, you are no more likely to be involved in a crash that day than you were the day before when you wore your seatbelt. But I will tell you that if you woke up one morning and said, you know, heck, today I'm going to go start driving in between the lanes, and I'm going to find every one-way street that I can and drive against the traffic, you are more likely to be involved in a crash. So how could this possibly be that it says seatbelt has a severity weight of 7, whereas dangerous driving has a severity weight of 5? And the answer is really so crucial, because I think that no matter what, even with IRT, as we're evolving towards possibly a new model, and I stress the word possibly here, as we are possibly working towards a new model or using IRT to make a better determination of a safety culture, nothing is changing in terms of how this information works. The information is about determining a correlation, not the causation. Causation would be helping, using this information to predict the crash. Correlation is about identifying what kinds of behavioral existence of data results in a crash. And we can use this example of ice cream. There's a known study that when the sale of ice cream, when ice cream sales go up, so does the murder rate. Now, let's ask a question. Does that mean that cones and ice cream are homicidal and they're going out killing people? Or does it mean that there's something in the ice cream that the manufacturer's putting in there that makes people crazy, and the sugar rush is making people go out and start...
I'm pretty sure that's true.
Okay. You know, I'm sure there's going to be a couple of those, but the answer is that ice cream sales are not causing the murder rate to go up. Of course not. That's ridiculous. But what we can ask is that if we see that when ice cream sales go up, the murder rates go up, we can understand that there's probably some underlying factor which we may or may not be able to precisely identify, and that is the reason why there's a correlation between ice cream sales going up and the murder rates going up. And the truth is that they were able to determine that when the temperature rising is what creates an increase in murder rate. So when temperature goes up, interestingly, the murder rate also goes up.
And people eat more ice cream.
But, of course, as you can imagine, when temperatures go up, people are also eating more ice cream. So, again, it's not the actual ice cream that is causing the murder rate to go up. It's the increase in temperature. They were able to identify what it was in this particular case. But guess what? Now that we know that there's a correlation between ice cream sales and murder rate, we can actually monitor, forget about monitoring the temperature, we can monitor ice cream sales to try to figure out what the murder rate will look like. And that's correlation. And when we apply that to seatbelts, as I said, when you get up in the morning and you decide, today I'm not putting my seatbelt on, and you drive around, obviously you're putting yourself at risk, but you're no more likely to be involved in a crash other than Murphy's Law. I think Murphy's Law would say that the day you go driving around without your seatbelts, you're going to be involved in a crash. But, you know, from a real perspective of the likelihood, the probability, there's no cause and effect of not wearing your seatbelt. But what there is, what the FMCSA determined in their CSA analysis, in the current CSA model, is that there was a correlation between seatbelts, people that did not wear their seatbelts, and the crash rate. Why does that make sense? It makes sense because underlying the people that are not wearing their seatbelts is indicative of a poor safety culture. Because you know what? Quite frankly, it's one of the easiest things you can do to be safe. Put your seatbelt on. Really, there's no reason in today's day and age not to just take that strap and put it over your lap and click it in. So why would you not wear your seatbelt? Why would you not wear your seatbelt? And the reason is because, and you can start drawing the story here, but more than likely, absent of a really, really good excuse, more than likely you just don't care. And if you just don't care, you can start seeing how there's a correlation of that safety culture that makes you not wear a seatbelt that also may likely result in you being involved in a crash. And I stress this because this is the underlying theme of CSA altogether. Then, yesterday, today, tomorrow, it's all going to be about the correlation. So that brings us to where we are now, December 2015. Well, I mean, that's already a long time ago, right? But it feels like
4 years ago.
4 years ago, yeah. So the FAST Act, the Fix America's Surface Transportation Act, which is where the CSA scores, the basic scores, were removed from the public view for non-passenger carriers. However, again, keep in mind the underlying data is still there. The underlying is still there. It's still available. And the methodology being public allows people who care and to be able to compute the scores themselves. And for that reason, companies that were previously using the scores continue to do so. However, I think that what really did happen at that point in time is people in the companies that we work with, that I work with specifically, became aware of the fact that government scores can come and go. They definitely can. And therefore, using the scores straight up has never been their be-all, end-all. And it's really about using the categories, which are very well done, using that information to say, how do we drill into this information to make the information work better for us? So CSA today,
Where'd you go?
I don't know. CSA today, the data's still here. It's more relevant than ever. The public has become more comfortable with evaluating the underlying data, and the scores are less of a distraction. So if you go to the government's SMS website, the scores are not there. The measures are there, but the measures are much harder to process because they're not peer-based. And people have learned to be able to look at the information, that it helps them to understand that the information is categorized. It helps them to assess a specific evaluation area, whether it's a specific category of behavioral analysis, whether it's unsafe driving, your driver fitness. They know where to look for the individual categories to determine, based on their underwriting guidelines, whether or not in a particular category they have an issue. I know one company we worked with had they determined that if they pulled out the non-English speaking drivers violations, the motor carriers that had non-English speaking drivers, pulled them out from their book entirely, their combined loss ratio improved dramatically.
And
so,
we know that there's been a movement away from just the scores, and all of the cases that have come out, those of you who have attended the October sessions have gone in and listened to Rob Mosley's wonderful presentation that he does every year, talking about the horrific cases that have come out during the course of the year, or you've read about them in the bits and pieces. And for a period of time, we were seeing the cases talking about the scores. And I would say that in my view, in reading them every month over the last 2 years, that the litigations have moved away from the scores and moved more to a listing of violations. So now you get a lawsuit against a motor carrier, and they will allege not that they have a bad basic score, but they will allege that they have 42 violations for tires and 32 violations for driver medical records or driver's hours of service, because the understanding and the recollection or the recognition by the plaintiff's attorneys in these cases is that the greater number of violations just allows you to impact the jury by their hearing those large numbers. A score is just a score. So again, that's why the data is being used more specifically. So the presence or absence of the score is not as important.
Gene, what you're saying, and going back to what Susan just said a few minutes ago, is that even and I had never really thought of this term until how he just explained this, is that that's what the plaintiff's attorneys in this reptile theory is using. They're showing that this motor carrier has such a bad culture. Right. You need to get them off the highway, or her off the highway. And so they're using it for the same thing that we're looking from underwriting. We're trying to see if their culture makes them a safe operator. They're trying to say the public, their culture, here's all these things they have done wrong. Therefore, they should not be out there damaging the public. So I think, that putting that together, kind of does that same thing. Earlier I made a point here. There was this horrendous crash up in about a month ago up in Gainesville, Florida, where 4 or 5 people got killed, 2 trucks got involved. And I was in Orlando when this was happening, and I read the newspaper report or listened to the TV reports, and they were already citing these violations that the motor carriers had no idea even which one caused the crash. So it becomes so public so quickly now.
They weren't citing to a score because they didn't have that yet, but it didn't matter. They had all the violations. And when you flip it over to the claim side, it's become very relevant in doing a loss assessment for reserve purposes, for whether or not we settle this claim earlier or later. The more violations there are that exist, even again, if they're not related specifically to the crash, will exponentially increase that potential verdict. And so it has just such a triggering effect or domino effect throughout the entire process of the underwriting, the claims, the analysis, everything, that you don't need the score as much.
Gene, you use the term verdict, and I know we're saying the same thing, but what happens a lot of these times is that mediation is coming up, and the insurance adjusters are afraid that if it gets in the jury, it will go the wrong way. So even at mediation, they're throwing more dollars in to keep it away from the jury before it ever goes to, quote, a judgment, unquote.
Yep. Well, of course, that's the case. I for 35 years was the attorney. I don't want to be the person. I don't want to be the claims adjuster who has to walk down the hall to the chief claims officer and say that I could have settled something for $500,000 and now there's a $7 million verdict because I didn't settle it at mediation. That's just a fact of how the industry operates.
So just to take a look at CSA today, there's some points here that, again, I want to stress the information has matured over time. So, the FAST Act was in 2015. But, even before that, insurance companies were taking the initiative to start studying the data. And over the years, over the time, even after the scores went away, considering this information is still available, the underlying information, the underlying inspection information, the violation information, information has matured, and insurance companies themselves, the experts that have, these data scientists at insurance companies have validated against their own loss runs and their own loss history to determine that this information is predictive. And for that reason, the use of this information is so crucial for insurance companies because they have determined that it really does make a difference. Using the data versus not using the data makes a tremendous difference. And for those of you on the agency level that are submitting these applications to insurance companies are understanding that the insurance companies are looking at the data and are saying that, we can't do certain things because of the fact that we have determined that this information impacts our loss ratios. And the insurance companies have built models around the data. And you know what? We talk about insurance, and that is a focus of this this webinar here today. But keep in mind that it's used in many different sectors as well. It's not just limited to the insurance companies themselves. Many different areas, including the shipping sectors, the logistics companies, they're using this information to help them in making better decisions. That's really what it comes down to in their risk assessment. And go ahead.
I know. I was to say I've run into a couple cases just recently, and I'm looking into them even more. Where I've been involved in looking at some brokers because of this history, and rating. But sometimes these people doing the same, using the same information you do, who helps the insurance industry, is also saying to brokers, "We'll score this motor carrier for you and give them an overall score." And part of it is based on these things that we just been talking about. And if you're not on that particularly provider, that third-party information to that broker, if you're not on their good side, you don't get as good a load. So it is being used even there in more detail than I had thought, because I just ran into this a couple times lately in the last couple months.
Well, part of that that derives from the fact that everybody has a concern. Everybody gets brought into every litigation, every loss, and the other component of it is that if I'm a transportation broker, I've got to get this freight delivered. I don't want a motor carrier that is more likely to get his truck pulled off the side of the road, but be put out of service while he's trying to transport my freight. My business is getting that freight delivered. And so every one of those, they have the issue of the potential exposure to a third party for a truck accident. But at the end of the day, they're trying to stay in business. They've got to get that freight delivered safely. If they're hiring a motor carrier that has a lot of vehicle problems or a lot of driver problems, there's a greater chance that the freight won't be delivered on time, at least from a predictive standpoint. So that's the reason why this is being used throughout all of the industries that touch the transportation segment.
Yep, and it's just to move along, where we are today and leading into tomorrow.
I'm sorry, we never have enough time. It's
important to keep in mind that this methodology has not been static. It has moved along with the industry. Most recently, with the ELD violations and being incorporated into it, the methodology has responded and evolved to address industry concerns. So as things have been moving, the FMCSA has been adapting and creating new violations with new severity weights, trying to constantly sample the data to help improve the predictability of the data for purposes of this crash reduction. Now, where we are right now is that the FMCSA is currently in the process of trying to develop and sample and test an IRT model approach. The IRT model is based on the National Academy's report. National Academy of Sciences wrote up a report and wrote as it says here, the FMCSA should develop a model, more statistically principled approach to the task, based on this IRT, which is the item response theory model, which has been applied successfully in informing policy decisions in other areas. Notably, transportation is not one of them, which is why it's kind of like a new process here for transportation to determine if it can be used successfully. But the important things to stress here are that the National Academy of Science didn't say to use it. They just said to try to develop one and determine if the model is demonstrated to perform well, then they should consider using it to replace SMS. So it's important to say, well, IRT is coming, IRT is coming. It's kind of Paul Revere, knocking down the woods. Is it coming? Is it not coming? I think there are going to be changes for sure. But this IRT, what it actually means and how dramatic things are going to change, remember, it is incredibly important to keep this in mind. IRT will be using the same data, and IRT will be about the same issue, trying to use information to determine the correlations. Remember, the correlation here is all about safety culture. What do these violations mean? Why do we care about these violations? We care about them in as much as we can identify a safety culture. A safety culture means that if they have a good safety culture, they're less likely to be involved in a crash. Doesn't mean they won't be, but it means they're less likely. And a poor safety culture means that they have a higher likelihood of being involved in a crash. Doesn't mean they will be, but it means that they have a higher likelihood. And that is really what it's all about. So the FMCSA, where they are currently now, is looking to develop an IRT model, and they are currently in a small-scale rollout of it. But in addition to that, some of the other points that were in the NAS recommendation were for looking for ways to collaborate more with the states to improve their data and consider non-MCMIS sources of data. These are in the recommendation, and the FMCSA officially is trying to pursue this. However, it's important to note that they don't currently have this process in place. So no matter what, the IRT model as it's currently being tested is not including additional data, nor is it including improved MCMIS data. It's using the same underlying data, and it's using the same underlying information. As far as structuring a user-friendly version of MCMIS data file to facilitate its use by external parties, part of that is already done, but more than that, right now, it's really about information. I think that the FMCSA feels that, to a certain degree, they are having trouble communicating that this is not about branding a motor carrier as a good carrier or a bad carrier. That goes back to the origins of CSA when they had the deficient status. Originally, they were called deficient carriers if they were above the threshold. After a compromise, they reduced it from deficient status down to alert status, and then from alert status, they went to yellow triangle exclamation mark status, which suddenly everybody was happy with, which just goes to show you that it's not about trying to say that you're bad, you're good, but using the information to create this attempt at identifying how this correlates to their safety culture. And then based on this, they're going to decide whether or not they're going to use both an absolute and relative metric, but these things are still to be determined. And it's very important to say that even where we are right now, the FMCSA has still not made any determinations on whether or not this information will be used, how they will ultimately use it. They are still in the process of determining how IRT can possibly improve the model. Now, since we're talking about IRT,
just remember we have 10 minutes left, tops.
It's okay.
We have a lot of stuff left.
Well, go ahead.
All right. Okay.
IRT is, as you mentioned, it's a complex model, but it tests data. This is really the most important part. Is it tests data and identifies correlations not apparent to expert judgment. And Tommy, we were discussing this I think before we started, but this comes down to things that don't go down to your own. As an expert, you make presumptions that seem to make sense. For example, expert opinion or just looking at the data would presume that somebody who has violations where they're speeding 15 or more miles an hour is more likely to be involved in a crash or indicative of a poor safety culture. The IRT, as Mr. Joe DiLorenzo reported recently, seemed to indicate that actually speeding 6 to 10 was more correlative. Doesn't mean that speeding 6 to 10 means they're going to be more likely in a crash than speeding 15 plus. Speeding 15 plus probably means if somebody's speeding 15 or more miles an hour down the road and someone else is driving 6 to 10 miles an hour more down the road, my guess would be that it's still true that the one driving at this moment 15 or more miles an hour down the road is more likely to be involved in a crash. However, IRT brings to the surface that from the ability to use this data to predict and to correlate to their safety culture, 6 to 10 correlates better.
Shuie, let me. I know we got time for this, but I slightly have a different approach than you do, because what we're talking about is DOT recordable crashes, not severity. Because this is what I point out here. You're probably going to have more severity when you're off the interstate highway going to 45 miles an hour than 6 to 10 off the interstate, right? Because you're going to get more small fender benders run into the back. Somebody's hit the side of you. So that's also a part of the correlation, is that usually if you're going 6 to 10 miles an hour, you're in a more congested area than somebody going over 15. So that's why I'm saying it's not absolute. You got this, and none of this predicts severity. That's one thing that's in all of this.
Exactly. And the point is, it's not about predicting severity. It's about correlating to safety culture. And some data elements, according to IRT, will not be able to correlate because they're just not data points that, using this model, correlate to anything, whereas some will be. And that's really what IRT is all about, is, you know, after the fact, we can sit here and debate why this makes any sense, but the point is that IRT can help elevate this above expert opinion and turn it into more of a statistical approach to try to find these identifiers. So the objective of IRT is data-driven model to identify the true safety indicators, and a model which allows for evolving data sources. You can feed additional data sources into IRT and it will still perform. It can just use more information more effectively. And then this is the big one, which is the possible creation of an overall safety culture score. Now, is this where the FMCSA will end up? Will they go down this road? It's you know, in the latest points from Joe DiLorenzo, he didn't even really bring that down in his points at all. He didn't mention the safety culture score there at all. And the question is whether or not they will actually create such a score, and whether or not even such a score will be received well, because we've seen that individualized scores, motor carriers are not particularly happy when there's a score out there that makes them look bad. And when the score makes everybody look good, it's really not very, very useful at all. So the question is whether or not such a safety culture score will be the end result of IRT is still to be determined. It may not, but I will tell you that where they are right now, they do not have a method for computing the safety culture score yet. And some other facts here, which we could just skip over, but there are additional factors that they're going to be considering, and these are things that they're doing in their sampling phase right now in their tests to determine whether or not they would take these other factors into consideration, whether maybe they'll use more weight multipliers and whether or not they'll use a confidence score. But these are additional factors that are things that the FMCSA is still trying to determine.
I've always said that the people with the better analysis, ability to do an analysis, is the insurance company, because IRT right now is still based on the same critical data points that they were using before. It's just a matter of how you look at them, not the addition of new information. The new information, you know, they talked about whether or not they could get driver information, the driver turnover rates. The trucking industry as a whole is generally not going to be willing to voluntarily give up that information. Just like they didn't really want to have their financials public, because truck brokers' financials weren't public, freight forwarders weren't public. They didn't want these other entities that were in the transportation industry to have a leg up on them. I get that. I understand it. The insurance industry are the ones that really have that other piece of data. And what is that other piece of data? It's the loss runs. And we've spent a lot of time talking to all of these insurance companies who take this information and overlay it with their loss runs, and they really get the ability to use that data points to add to this model, creating their own model, which is a different form, I guess, really of an IRT, right? Well, it's their own model, it's their own form of an IRT.
Exactly, IRT is a particular methodology. But ultimately, CSA yesterday was about using CSA, the underlying inspection and violation and crash data, to identify the safety culture. Today, CSA is used to try to identify what the safety culture is. And guess what? Tomorrow with IRT, that is the ultimate intent. So really, from that perspective, nothing's really changing. It's about the evolution of data. It's about using this information to try to move ahead and make better decisions.
Gene, I want to add, again, I don't want to blade this too much, but your point you just made, any data that they'll use that's other than the roadside data will be based on the information the motor carrier gives the government, and that, as we have seen, is in the updates in the 150 form, and we know how much that information is accurate, do we not?
Yeah.
That's the problem. The same problems continue to exist, so where's the improvement? And really the answer is that the improvement comes that IRT can potentially identify correlators that are beyond what expert opinion would determine. As we saw with the speeding violations, that's where IRT can be a tremendous help. If everything remains the same with the data and everything remains the same with the information fed into the system, then the improvements can be in trying to use a statistical analysis to make to raise things to the surface that we otherwise would not have seen. Now, where we are tomorrow, where's IRT now? As Joe DiLorenzo recently said about a month ago, he said it's a model with various possible implementations. As somebody else mentioned to me, I hope this doesn't offend anybody, but he said there's many ways to skin the IRT cat. So no offense to cats and for the cat lovers out there, but there are many different ways to skin that IRT cat that the FMCSA is still trying to figure out. So they don't have a process yet. As they mentioned, the amount of information that is used, if they use all the information that they currently have, it can take a month to process information. If you start adding variances for geographic, it increases the complexity, and they don't have the processing ability to even do that. So they need to come up with a way of trying to reduce the number of input factors to be able to make it something that can be processed on a recurring basis. So they say 2 years are needed due to the complexity and the amount of data. Of course, as all things government, timeline is subject to change. And then the small-scale modeling phase is currently ongoing, and we hope that later 2019, maybe springtime, we should have some more updates as far as where they're standing. But the things we want to take out of this is that IRT is an evolution of use of information, not a revolution, not a brand new thing. Is it all about the safety culture score, this whole brand new score? It's really, really not. It's about using the current information to make the data more predictive and indicative of their safety culture. So the results from the small-scale model, and this is actually taken from Joe DiLorenzo, results from small-scale model, this is so critical, are not drastically different from the results we are seeing from SMS. So far where they are on the small-scale model, as the FMCSA just reported, carriers with worse safety measures are still appearing at the top of the list using IRT, and carriers with the best safety measures are still at the bottom. So IRT compared to SMS so far is yielding almost identical results. So they're not drastically different, and the worst ones are still at the top, and the best ones are still at the bottom, whether you're using SMS and whether you're using IRT. The IRT model, as we saw, is giving a more detailed view of the impact of violation on safety, and it can say things that are not apparent to expert judgment. This is the most critical thing that they did put out there now, is that with all these things coming, with big changes coming, they put out the general construct of the SMS may remain the same. So they do put that out there and say, SMS, everyone's saying, oh, IRT is coming, get ready. But as Joe DiLorenzo recently said, SMS may, the whole general construct of the SMS system may remain the same, and the basics, there may be changes to how the basics are, whether it's in the violation severity weights or additional factors, but the general construct of the SMS may very likely remain the same.
Susie, I want to go back 1 second. What they're saying is, and correct me if I'm wrong, the SMS, which is the raw data we talk about, all this stuff, will stay the same. What might change is analysis that go back, whether you have the individual basics and individual event groups. I think that's what they're saying here, is it not?
Well, you know what? There's just really, if you see in a very well politically written statement here, they wrote, it may remain the same, and this may change. So pretty much they say very little, other than the fact that don't be surprised if nothing changes, and don't be surprised if everything changes, but more than likely it's going to be somewhere in the middle. And what those particular factors are, whether they're peer groups, whether it's using the measures, whether it's just changing the severity weights, improving the severity weights. Maybe they're just going to keep the basics categories as they are right now and use IRT to say, you know what, 6 to 10 is going to get a higher severity weight. Or maybe, as they mentioned, maybe they'll use it to improve the sufficiency levels. Right now you need a minimum number of inspections in order to qualify for any basic score. Maybe they'll say if you have a certain type of violation, then that's sufficient even if you only have 1 inspection. Or if you have a certain type of violations, you need 10 in order to be sufficient. So maybe they'll turn those things around. But again, they still are trying to figure this out themselves. They have not determined what they're going to do. They're trying different processes. And, as they said, they're leaving it up in the air right now, because at the end of the day, maybe nothing will change it. Ultimately, no matter how they change it, everything remains the same. I think they're going to try to want to make people happy and therefore incorporate some form of change just so that people can see that they didn't keep it exactly. But if ultimately the models are identical, then the path to least resistance is evolution and not this revolution.
Which is why the education that you provide, Tommy, and that that we do, and that all of these insurance agents and insurance companies are doing, is trying to focus more on what the information is rather than scores. Look at the data. If you're an insurance agent and you're going out to meet with your insured, look at those categories. Look where their violations are. Look at the trending issues. Help your insured to make his business operation better. That will help everybody. He will stay in business. He will need insurance. The insurance company will make money. There'll hopefully be a reduction in crashes. But it's looking beyond those scores and the colors to what that data really shows. That's not going to change whether it's IRT or the CSA model. That's the most critical feature, fact, to take away from all of this information.
Your ability to process information, your ability to understand the information, and your ability to understand how the information correlates to the operations and safety of a motor carrier are the most critical thing here. So to piggyback on a score is almost a dangerous thing to do. To say that there's one score that's going to rule them all, you know, there may be correlations there, but ultimately the more you educate yourself, the more your decisions and the more your decisions will be educated, and the more you'll be able to improve your own underwriting process.
And with that,
as you know, one of the cornerstones of the foundation's education is you've got to deliver more than a piece of paper to your insureds. You got to understand it and help them understand the system and help them understand things they can do to be a better insured. And all this goes with it and looks at these things. So that's one of the objectives, as you know, of everything that we teach is you got to do more than just delivering the piece of paper.
And you know what, Tom? Losses are going to occur. They're always going to occur. But if I sit down with an insured who had some problems and in response to those took some affirmative action, the fact that he still had a loss afterwards is not quite as severe, because his answer is, look, we've already taken these steps. We're doing all the right things, but losses occur. It's when nothing has happened and they've just continued to spiral into this downward trend that every loss becomes exponentially larger.
Sushi, go through the next couple slides and we'll close it out, my friend.
No, we're done.
We just wanted to make, you know, we want to put some cute looking bear here and just
I know.
reiterate that this is definitely information available. But really, we hope that, you know, the message was conveyed is that there's going to be things changing, you know, no matter what, hopefully improvements. But it's all about understanding that the underlying data can help you do a better job. No matter what line of business you're in, this information can help you, and it can help you understand. And even though it sometimes seems like it's an overwhelming amount and it's something that's too much to process, if you can understand how to categorize it and understand the meaning of why the FMCSA collects it and why they care about it, you can help
and
with
why
that
the insurance
information.
companies
And why insurance companies
it.
collect it and why insurance companies care about it, then you can help do a better job for yourself.
We've so many times had calls from motor carriers directly who were notified that their policy was being non-renewed or that their premium was going up so much more because of violations and because of events that had occurred, even though they had no losses. And it's really very interesting when you actually talk to them and you start to walk through what's there and why it's there and why an insurance company considers that a relevant factor, that they start to understand that they need to take those steps to better themselves. And that's really incumbent upon all of the agents who are dealing directly with the insureds to help them understand that information and why it's going to matter.
Yeah, and you can integrate yourself by communicating with them and saying, look, this is what's going to drive it, and this is what's going to push your premiums up, and here's what we can do, the steps we can take to improve so that we can continue to get you the best price possible.
I think what other slide we had, and the takeaway today is the information is there. We still got to use it, but we don't know what the changes are. They will be changes, but we won't know the effect of them until everything this gets through. So we'll keep through the foundation, and people, Gene, like you and others, we'll keep everybody abreast as much as we can to keep them in the loop. The next time we're going to look at it, let's see what this small study looks like. They say the spring, but I'm still waiting for the uniform registration system since 1998 to come out. So who knows their timelines?
I mean, you know, back in 1986 when they sold it, was it 86, 95 when they said they were getting rid of common and contract carriage.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So I'm not counting on any of this stuff happening, but it's interesting. I just thought there's enough public discussions out there. You hear enough about it. They're beyond the timeline. So I just think it was worthwhile, and I appreciate you spending your guys' time to bring this to us today to inform the people on the other end of this conversation that's listening to us to understand that we'll keep them abreast. The changes are here, but use the information like we talked about. So thank you very much on that part.
Going to be that bad.
Okay. All right, guys. That's it. Thank you. I hope you enjoy this. We'll see you next month at the next month's webinar. This is information we have here. Obviously, we now have a new LinkedIn, by the way, LinkedIn address now. You might want to look into this if you haven't looked at that. We're now posting more things there than before as we have our IT committee getting us moving forward and being more relevant in this marketplace. Thanks, Gene. Thanks, Shuie. You all have a great weekend. Everybody stay warm.
We're always here to talk. If they have any questions, feel free to contact us. We're happy to talk to anybody all the time. Have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.